Keren Rice is professor of linguistics at the University of Toronto. She is well known for her work documenting and revitalizing the First Nations languages, some of the First Nations languages in Canada, and is the recipient of numerous prizes and awards specifically for her work on Slavey, a Dene language used in the Northwest Territories, specifically in the Mackenzie River Valley. Both her grammar and her dictionary of Slavey remain titans of language documentation and actually long-standing models for the best ways and the most meticulous ways in which to create dictionaries and grammars. And in fact, the grammar of Slavey that she wrote won the very first Bloomfield Award from the Linguistic Society of America. She is the director of the University of Toronto's Aboriginal Studies program. She serves as the editor, long-standing editor, although I understand she's maybe almost done, of the International Journal of American Linguistics. And in 2012, she also served as the president of the Linguistic Society of America. She has a very long and dedicated history of service both to the people with whom she has worked and also the discipline to which we all belong. The Hale Professorship requires of its holder two things. One is that the professor teach a field methods course at a linguistic institute, which Keren has been doing with a group of enthusiastic students working on Malayalam. And the second requirement is that the Hale professor give a plenary lecture in the area of language documentation or field linguistics. This requirement is what Keren is fulfilling tonight with a lecture entitled Fieldwork and Community, Aspects of Variation and Change. So please join me in welcoming Keren.
So I hope that this part of it is as good as the class is, because the class is really fantastic. So as Robin said, my role at the Institute is to try to meet the expectations of Ken Hale, and those are pretty high expectations to meet for anyone that knew him. He's a real model for, I think, everybody that does work on languages, at least in North America, and I think around the world. He cared deeply about languages, large and small. He cared about linguistic theory. He cared about working and training with speakers. And he set the bar high for all of us to try to meet. So if I can come even this close to what Ken Hale did, it's a real honor for me. So last week, lots of us listened to Janet Pierre-Humbert, and she gave a fantastic talk about big languages. So when you work on endangered languages, you're not working on big languages, you're working on small languages. So my focus today is going to be twofold. One is on responsibilities of working with people who are speakers of small languages, and one is working with language materials that are old and language materials are new. And I'm going to use this word variation that's here in the title in a lot of different ways. So I'll use it to mean space, I'll use it to mean time, topics, individuals. So we'll see it throughout the talk. So when I started thinking about this talk, I happened to read an article in the newspaper about this book, The Family of Man. So some of you might remember this from the 1950s. I don't remember it as an exhibit at the Museum of Modern Art, but I really remember the book. And what they were talking about in the newspaper article was how this book kind of changed things in looking at people around the world and thinking about universals across humanity, rather than thinking about everybody being different. And this was meant to be a really positive step in how it is we look at things. So what we find now, 60 years later, is the title of this institute, which maintains the universals, which really have been a focus in linguistics and in the world more broadly for some time now, and adding to that the theme of variability. So what is it that's the same, and what is it that differs? So this is what I'm going to try to do, is talk some in two different areas about universality and variability. So I want to talk about variation in working with people and with communities. And I want to talk about variation in language, and here we'll look at some of the aspects of the Dene language that Robin mentioned and what that might tell us. And then I'm going to add into this, especially when I start talking about the Dene languages, about language change and how that fits in. Okay, so this is a big and mixed audience, and so not really sure where everybody comes from. And so I thought I should just give a little bit of background on some of the changes that have been taking place in thinking about fieldwork. And these are changes that we see in linguistics, but they're actually changes that are happening in social science much more broadly. And I'll talk about them with respect to linguistic work. So this year at the LSA, there was a session on methodology and practice in what's called collaborative endangered language research that Eva Tchaikovsky-Higgins and Mary Lynn organized. So I'm just going to take some definitions from them. We could have lots more ways of talking about these things that I'm going to talk about now. So they define two types of linguistic models. One they call non-collaborative models. And this they define as the linguist expert controls the form and results of the research. This might sound negative. They didn't really mean it to be negative. This is a way of doing research where basically, as the linguist, you go and work in a community and work with people, but it's kind of the things that you're choosing to work on. Maybe you want to write a grammar of the language, maybe you want to do a dictionary, maybe you want to do theoretical work, but you're kind of defining, here's the topics that I care about, these are the things that I want to do. And they contrast that with collaborative models. Collaborative models have lots of different names, and I'm just going to call them collaborative models. And the way they define that is that the roles played by linguists and by community members in the research are redefined so that the priorities and expertise of communities and speakers are considered in research design and implementation. So the difference here is that it's not just the researcher who is going in and controlling things, but it's working together to decide what are the priorities. It doesn't mean it's all community priorities. The community might say to somebody, we'd like you to do such and such. It also doesn't necessarily mean in the broadest of senses that you as the linguist working in the community are necessarily even doing language work. You might be asked to do something very different. So when we take collaboration in the broadest sense, it can mean all kinds of things, like cooking dinner for somebody or cleaning the roads or whatever. It can mean a wide range of things in the broadest of senses. So I think I skipped one. No, I didn't. In doing field work, we've often used these prepositions. So one preposition is on, so you're doing work on a language in a community. For is kind of moving it to who the people are, so you're doing work for them. With is a preposition that means together with, and by means the linguist is sort of out of it, and it's the community that's doing the work. So these prepositions are ones that you find, and the one that I'm going to kind of focus on is with, and just what with means. Okay, so I want to talk about why there are collaborative methodologies, the reasons that people give, and then talk a little bit about the development of the collaborative methodologies. So this list is just a sort of a laundry list. It's not in any particular order. So we find one reason for collaborative methodologies is that it involves ethics with respect to treatment of people. So people often really want to work with you and be part of all of this. And if you look at the early literature on endangered languages, it was all kind of about languages. So let's worry about these languages that are disappearing. It wasn't so much about people, it was about record the language, because what's going to happen if the language disappears? So there's been kind of a shift to say, hey, wait a minute, what about the people that speak those languages? You can't just go and treat people like machines who are going to give you their languages. They're people. And so this is one reason for the development of collaborative methodologies. If you look at the literature on the development of Aboriginal research methodologies, one of the things that's really stressed in that literature is the power differentials that there's been in research. So when we think of that preposition on, with the researcher coming in and saying, this is what I want to do, then there's a real power differential where the researcher says, this is what I want, and the person is treated sort of like the word subject, and they give back whatever it is the researcher wants. And that shift in power differentials is part of what's leading to these collaborative methodologies. From the perspective of the linguist, you learn a lot about languages that you would never learn otherwise if you're just working in a method where you control everything. So this is another reason that's given. People often use the phrase giving back and serving the needs of the community, and then contributing to language revitalization. So there's more things we could talk about here, but these are just a few of them. Okay. These collaborative methodologies are now being talked about around the world, but they really developed in countries like Canada, like the United States, like Australia, like New Zealand. So countries where Indigenous peoples were calling for research that meets their needs. And I'm just giving one quote here from someone named April Counselor. She's an Alutiiq scholar from Alaska and a language activist. And this comes from from her dissertation. And I heard her talk about this at a meeting I was at last year of the Arctic Council, and I just thought I'd use her just because I'd met her. So what she talks about is a continuum of research where you start at one end, and which is the kind of on end of it, that is the research that's, this is the second one there, initiated and conducted by outsiders. And then you go to the other end, and that's the one that's the first one here, that's the research that's initiated and conducted by insiders. And what she says is that the more insider, the more the self-determination, the greater the self-determination. And so she's not saying it all has to be only insider, but she's saying it should be more towards that end. And she gives a lot of reasons for this and a lot of responsibilities that the outsider has in doing research. And these include empowering communities to collaborate, including Indigenous scholars and people who work with communities, incorporating training, mentoring, and/or professional development, so what she calls reciprocal learning, protecting Indigenous control of design, data collection and analysis, and reporting, respecting the diversity of each Indigenous context, not everybody's the same, and providing direct benefits to a community. Okay, so and you find this not just what April Counselor says, but if you read the literature on Aboriginal research methods, this is the kind of statements that you're finding in general in that literature. So the question that I've gotten really interested in, coming from this kind of background and working within this kind of model, the question I've gotten really interested in is, what does collaboration mean? And you know, we can put that as, what does with mean? And what I've become concerned about is that it seems like in a lot of places this notion of collaborative is being defined, not necessarily on the ground, but in thinking about it sort of philosophically in a rather rigid way of saying that to be with, you've got to be satisfying all of these types of things. Not necessarily, these aren't necessarily the only ones, but these kinds of things. So you've got to be empowering to collaborate. You've got to be doing training. You've got to be doing work on language revitalization. You've got to be publishing with the community. And I actually think this is a really dangerous thing, to define something in too narrow a way so that it leaves out all kinds of, on the one hand, research that might be really interesting and valuable, and on the other hand, communities who just aren't ready or able to enter into this kind of research model. So that's sort of the point that I really want to make in this, is that you've got to be really careful that as the kind of outsiders, you're not still calling the shots. And there was a really interesting article in the University of Toronto newspaper sometime last fall, and this was somebody talking about international volunteering. And what didn't have anything to do with language work whatsoever. It was international volunteering. And what he said was, for all our willingness to help, for whatever reason, we shouldn't presume that others are in absolute need of our help or that our help is absolute. So I think in lots of ways we're buying into these models, which are really, really totally appropriate in some circumstances. But you go to other circumstances and they're just not the right things to be doing. And sorting this stuff out isn't necessarily an easy thing. So when I went to this meeting of the Arctic Council, I was asked to talk about collaborative research models. This was a meeting actually about assessing language vitality in the Arctic. I don't think I said exactly what's said here, but this was how it was written down, what I said. So I said something along the lines of that as outsiders, we can't insist that people be involved every day. Like lots of places, that's not the right model, and it's not going to work. So in a way, it makes the job even more complex in trying to figure out, not that you can go in with a model and say, okay, here's some cameras, you record, or I want to train you how to transcribe, but what is it that's needed there at that time? Sometimes there's just too much going on in the community for people to want to get involved in doing anything that you want to do other than be a kind of traditional consultant. Sometimes there's a lot more, and sometimes, as the next one says, we've got to think about time. Things change over time. We've got to think about we're flying in and out often, maybe staying for months at a time, but still we're going in and we're going out. How does that affect things? A lot of times at the beginning, nobody knows you. They're not necessarily going to want to do things. You're there longer, and then people want to do things with you that they didn't want to do at the beginning. You're trusted with things as time goes on. So what I would really say is that what we really need is a broader understanding of the term collaborative. So it's not this kind of lockstep, here's what collaborative has to mean, but it's really trying to figure out what it means in this particular instance, at this particular moment in time, to be working with each other. And it could be that you're cleaning the roads. It could be all sorts of things, and they can all be ways of working together. There's these words with R's that are often used a lot in the research on Aboriginal research methodology. So these are relationships, respect, responsibility, and reciprocity. And reciprocity doesn't mean everybody doing the same thing. It can be defined in very different ways. So probably lots of you have thought about all of these things already, but I felt I've just been reading a lot of things that are kind of saying, here's how you have to do it, and here's the ethical guidelines that you have to meet. And I'm just trying to say, I think it's a lot more variable than that. There's not a one-size-fits-all, and what you do now and what you do 2 years from now and 5 years from now and 10 years from now with the same people in the same community is going to be different. It's like your relationships with people change over time, and we've just got to do that. Makes it harder, but it also makes it more interesting, and it can be a lot of work and it can be a lot of pleasure. So I wanted to give that as background as I turn to now a really different topic. And I don't know if these pieces fit together. I'm going to try to fit them together at the end, but I felt like I sort of wanted to talk about the things that I've been thinking about a lot in recent years. So what I'm going to turn to is a project that's going on now and has been for some time in what's called the Saw-2 region. I'll show you a map in a minute. Saw-2 means Bear Lake. Saw is bear, and 2 is the word for water. Region of the Northwest Territories. So let me just tell you a little tiny bit about this project. This is a project that originates in the community of Delaney. And again, I'll show you the map in a minute. And this is a community that was really only settled in about the 1950s, and people have only in maybe the past 30 years really moved largely into the community. In a lot of parts of northern Canada, there weren't any treaties signed, and what happened was that in the past 15 years or so, there's been negotiation between the communities and the government for what's called self-government. And in this particular community, there's been a lot of emphasis placed on what's called Denet's Inlim, what it means to be a Dene person. And what people are really interested in is looking at the places they came from and how they're different and how they're the same in different places. And so what we're working on is stories and stories of people, and kind of trying to understand what the core values are of what it means to be a Dene person and how they differ depending on where people come from. So, of course, what I'm really interested in is the language, and so that's the focus, but we're doing this language work through stories coming from people from different places, different ages, or their background is from different places and different ages. And so I just want to paraphrase, what you find is a relationship between two communities that we're going to focus on, and people in Delaney say, well, people say that we came from the people there. In another community, they say that those people came from here. How come our languages are so different? So what I'm going to focus on is how come our languages are so different. And this is part of a community project where we're kind of planning together, but we're taking on different roles, and it's really evolved over the years. Okay, now this is kind of historical linguistics, and there's lots of you that do historical linguistics, and it's kind of sociolinguistics, and there's lots of you who do sociolinguistics. So I'm sort of hoping for you to guide me in whether what I'm going to say sounds like something reasonable or sounds like it's just really absurd. Okay, so here we are in the Northwest Territories. So this is the boundary. Let me see if I can remember how to do this. Okay, that's the boundary between the United States and Canada. We're going to go way up here. That's called North Slavey. Okay, so that's the region that we're going to be in. And now let me show you a map of the area. So this is a map put up by the Northwest Territories government, and we're going to be in this North Slavey region, and we're going to look in particular at Fort Good Hope and at Delaney. This is Great Bear Lake. It's one of the largest freshwater lakes in the world. And Fort Good Hope is on the Mackenzie River. So does that sort of situate you? Fort Good Hope is about 10 miles south of the Arctic Circle. So we're, we're reasonably far north here. We've light all day now, all night, 24 hours. Okay, so this particular project was of interest to me recently because of how people are really interested in how Delaney was settled and what their relationships are with other people. And as you read the literature, there's a really uneasy fit between claims about change of language and claims about where people came from. So what I wanted to do was go back and look at the things I had read many years ago to see how, after several years, I wanted to look at those and see if they seemed the same to me as they did before. I read them, I read the literature, and then I set them aside. So what we're going to look at is areas that are said to be the area that people inhabited at the time of contact. So that was probably somewhere around 1800, slightly after 1800. And so we're going to look at, let me see if I can find it. See where it says hair? Okay, that's what we're going to look at, the part that says hair. And this is Great Bear Lake. So you notice in that area, there's just hair. If we go over to this map, this is a map that's taken from an article by Michael Krauss, and the details don't matter. It's just when I could find the areas. So we're going to look at the one that's called hair there. Now all of a sudden, you see here's Great Bear Lake, and instead of just being one undifferentiated region, what we've got there is Bear Lake as something separate. So that's the claim, is that at the time of contact, we had one language, and then at some point post-contact, it differentiated into two different languages. Okay, so that's the problem that we're going to look at. Okay, so let's look at some data. Okay, so the language is traditionally called North Slavey, but it's more often today called Dene. That's the word for person. We're going to look at two communities. Fort Good Hope is the one that was called Hare, and Delaney is the one that was called Bear Lake. Sorry about all these words, but it's just how it is. Okay, so there are a lot of sound differences between the communities, and these are regular correspondences. So where you got in Delaney the WH, which is a voiceless W, so that's wah. You always get a W in Hare, so that's wah. Where you've got the qua in Delaney, qua, it's fa. Where you've got the qua for mosquito, it's we. That one's hard to hear. And this last word, nake, where you've got the N in Delaney, it's almost always, in the examples we're going to look at, always an R in Fort Good Hope, rake. And I'll just tell you in a side story that's just interesting. Once people came to realize that there was a difference between, we were doing orthography standardization, and they came to realize that there was a difference between an E and an A, they said, okay, we get the E all over the place, so let's write that with the letter E. That's what we're used to. Okay, what are we going to use for that other one? Oh, you know, there's that funny letter in linguistics that's called schwa. Let's use that. So the schwa is an A. And some people are horrified by this, but it just tells you the arbitrariness of writing systems. Okay, these are some of the lexical differences that we find between these dialects, and I haven't given you very many, just a few of the lexical differences. So words like meat, yeah, be actually means food, norm kind of not surprising thing. Be, it means food in Fort Good Hope. The different words for all sorts of things, numbers, animals. There's lots of different verb stems. The word he is both instrumental and meaning commutative with in Fort Good Hope, and in is instrumental in. So you get a lot of differences here. And there's other differences too. So in Fort Good Hope, you find more than one highly productive way of making negatives, whereas in Delaney, there's just one productive way of making negatives. There's different ways of making the future in the different dialects. And I could enumerate these, but I just wanted to give you the idea that there's quite a lot of differences between the language as it's been spoken for at least the last 100 years in Fort Good Hope. Well, maybe I should say 90 years in Fort Good Hope and in Delaney. Okay, so when we look at so that's the language. So now we'll look at what the ethnographic accounts say. So these are hunter-gatherer societies traditionally, and they're still very hunting-based today. And June Helm, who was an anthropologist who did a lot of work in this part of the world, says that the way of life, hunting, gathering, moving around in small groups, sometimes larger groups, those larger groups not very large, endured for over 100 years up to the 1950s, and that then there were things like mandatory schooling and so on that changed the way of life to some degree. And she says the process of change was slow and untraumatic, even after the missionary joined the trader as the other agent of contact and acculturation. So here's a picture of not very much change from the time of contact. So looking at the language, what Hale goes on to say is she talks about Petito, who we'll talk a lot about. He was an oblate missionary who was many years in the north and one of those incredible language learners. And we'll look a little bit at his work. So what Hale writes about Petito, that he identified two regional bands of Podiliev. Podiliev is the same as hare. It means hare skin, who exploited the northern shores of Great Bear Lake, but that by the early 20th century, they were no longer identifiably hare. They had become part of a people that then became self-identified as Satutena. So remember, in the first map, we just saw hare, and then the second map, we saw hare and Bear Lake. So this is what she's saying happened in that time period. And she says that this probably had to be due to the fact that people went to the forts, and that the fact that hare is a well-defined dialect with little internal diversity is almost surely the consequence of the ingathering at the forts. Okay. So this is a really interesting hypothesis, and it seems reasonable if you look at what Helm says and what Howren says about the beginning of Christianization in this time period. Sort of seems reasonable in that perspective. But to me, it seems a little bit odd at the same time. And it seems odd because what everybody writes about there is that there was hardly any change in the way of life over that time period. It's true people went to the forts, but they went to the forts to trade their furs, and maybe they hung around there for a few weeks, but they didn't really move to the forts. They didn't actually really move into the communities until the 1950s when schooling became mandatory. So this seems like, to me, and this is why I'm really interested in what all of you who know more about this than I do have to say, it seems like an odd hypothesis to me. So that I went and thought, how come there was this large language change taking place? Why did this happen? So I thought about, maybe I should go back and look at the dictionary. And I just thought this is an interesting quote from Sapir. He says, linguistic evidence is difficult to handle, full of phonological pitfalls, require a closeness of knowledge that is often out of proportion to what can be obtained from it for tangible cultural inference. So let's see, can we get overwhelmed by this, like Sapir says often happens, or can we discover something? Okay, what we have in this area is material from 3 points in time. One is this dictionary by Petito that was done in the 1860s. He's got in that dictionary a column that's called Podiliev, or hare skin, and then he's got, as we'll see, a number of entries under that that he calls Podiliev de Grand Lac des Ors, so hare skin of Great Bear Lake. Then Fengui Li, who is probably best known for his work on Chinese and Thai, but did amazing work on Athabascan languages, did some work with a speaker of hare in 1929. And I'm not going to show you that data, but it looks like the current hare. And then we've got current Bear Lake. So what we're going to do is look at the dictionary. The dictionary is kind of incredible. So this is just a page from that dictionary. So this is a column in French. This column is in what he called Montagnier. It's also called Chipewyan, and now it's more commonly called Denisoulina. This is a column that's Podiliev. That one is a column that's Lushu, which is more commonly called Gwich'in now. Okay, so those are 3 Athabascan languages. In this column, I'm not expecting you to be able to read it, but in this column, he has lots of entries, and that he says the first one is the most common one. Then he often gives entries with things in parentheses, and those things in parentheses are the things that we're going to pay attention to. But interestingly, the people who have worked with the dictionary before didn't pay attention to the thing in parentheses, and that's actually the clue, that you've got to pay attention to the thing in parentheses. And I should tell you, we tried to OCR this, but it doesn't work. So we just, it's a not very good photocopy of the dictionary. Okay, here's some actual sample entries. So what I've put in this first column is the form that Petitot gives, and I put what his symbol stands for in the square brackets, and that L with the thing through it is a voiceless L. Okay, then I've put the column that he labels B, which stands for Batar Lushu, so that's bastard Lushu. So Lushu is, like I said, and it's a completely different language. So people didn't pay any attention to that. Okay, then is Hareskin of Great Bear Lake, and then Current Bear Lake and Current Hare. So if you look at these, I'm not going to go through them, but if you look at these, what you can see is what's listed under the Batar Lushu column. The second column looks like what's listed under the Current Hare column. Okay? I won't go through the words, but I think it's sort of obvious. And what's listed under the Podoliev column is like what's listed under the Current Bear Lake column. And I've just given you a small sampling of words, but this is pretty systematic throughout the dictionary. Then here's some lexical items. And again, you see pretty much the same thing, that what's listed under the Batar Lushu column and under the For Good Hope column are the same, and what's listed under the Podoliev column is pretty much the same as what's listed under the Delaney column. You can see his transcription system is different, but I think they're close enough to be able to make it out. And then what's under the general Podoliev column is sort of a mix of things. Okay, so here's just a summary of the sound correspondences, and I won't go through these in detail, but basically what we find is if we look at Delaney and For Good Hope, where you've got so in Delaney, you've got S in For Good Hope, where you've got ch in Delaney, you've got sh in For Good Hope. So these regular correspondences, there's a systematic difference between Delaney and For Good Hope, and that's basically the systematic difference we find between the Podoliev, which is like the Delaney, and the Batar Lushu, which is like the For Good Hope. Okay, so there's a lot more in the Petitot dictionary than we had realized was in the Petitot dictionary when we look at it more carefully. So the one that I haven't talked about at all really is the N's and the R's. So when we look at the N's and the R's, here's just a few correspondences. So raze in Hare, naze in For Good Hope, reshe in Hare, neshe in For Good Hope, and so on. And what Haren says about that, he says, well, one of these changes, which seems to have begun after Petitot and have become fully established by 1929 when Lee did his work, is the change of N to R. And where he says Lee's data on Hare agree completely with his. He had done work in the 1960s on Hare and observed ours as it is today. This one is really interesting when you go back and look at Petitot, because what you have to do is you have to go to the beginning of the N's in alphabetical order and see that at the beginning of the French N's, this is the French N's in alphabetical order, what he says is, oh, N is susceptible to change into T and D and R is often replaced by D and N and L. And when you look in that Podoliev column, actually there's R's there, and his statement implies that there's a lot more R's. So this one, it's sort of hard to use directly, and I need to go through it in more detail than I have to try to find the ones that he labels specifically as Batar Lushu, but the ones I've looked at, they match up as well. Okay, so what it seems like then is that Petitot's Podiliev is overall similar to current Delany, with parts that are more like Forked Hope, and his Batar-Lucha is similar to the 1920s and to the current Forked Hope. And just out of interest, this is work that was done in Forked Hope by an anthropologist in the early 1960s. And what she says is that she was really excited that she had this dictionary that she could learn from, and then she's trying to learn from this dictionary, and they're rejecting everything. And they say, well, it sounds more like this other people. It doesn't sound like us. Okay? So I think the likely scenario is a little bit different, and actually way more in tune with the ethnographic account, that there was a lot of variation at the time of Petitot, unlike the picture that says it was this way at the time of Petitot, and then by the time of Lee, it just changed completely. I think that there was variation, with Batar-Lucha developing into what we call Hare, and Petitot's general Podiliev as what we call Bear Lake, without much change over time. We find lots of continuing variation today. So in Delany, where I wrote WH before, today you find people using W, so voices W and W, you find both of them. You find, and I did this by listening to recordings of elders, so telling stories, and they're quite long recordings where they're just talking about their lives and things like that. So they were recorded for a website where they were going around the Northwest Territories and recording elders. Lots of them are quite long. So I was just listening for certain key things. And you find in Delany, people usually use "tsa," but you hear S's sometimes where you'd expect "tsas." Usually they use "chus," but you hear "shus" sometimes where you would expect "chus." So there's actually variation, and this would be, I think, an interesting sociolinguistic study to look at. I haven't done that study, and so I'm not really giving you accurate quantitative information, but most of the time I would hear "tsa." Forked Hope, just the opposite. So in Forked Hope, you expect to hear "sa," but when you listen to the recordings of the Forked Hope elders, you hear "tsas" occasionally as well. You expect to hear "shus," you hear "chus." So where I say expect to, what that means is if you say to somebody, how do you say the word beaver? Anybody you go to in Forked Hope is going to tell you "sa." Anybody you go to in Delany is going to tell you "tsa," and that's very systematic. That's how people want them listed in the dictionary. So that's what I'm basing that on. Those are real signals of what community you're from. But nevertheless, there's in reality some variation in it. Okay, so my conclusions here then are that the settlement doesn't really appear to have led to any major changes in the languages, that we've got this variation continuing with certain things as areal markers, like lexical items and phonological characteristics. It's a matter of degree. But it was a matter of degree 150 years ago, too, when Petitot was doing his work. So what do I take away from all of this? Well, one is that we really have to take care in using our sources. And I think that it was really easy to get misled with the Petitot dictionary, which is just an amazing piece of work. But it's also really hard to use, and you've got to be ready to look more deeply. I think there's some other assumptions that have been sort of problematic in leading the ethnographers to something that they clearly weren't comfortable with. And that's that the term Hare is used all the time in the early literature by the early missionaries and the early explorers in that area. But you don't know really what it means. You don't know who they were talking to. And so it's hard to sort that out. And so when all of a sudden they realized the languages were different, that's when they started calling things Bear Lake instead of Hare. People were looking at registration, so somebody's name listed as being a trader at a particular mission, or as being trader at a particular fort, or being part of a particular mission. But you don't know what what that means either, because maybe they were there for a week and their name got on the record, and then they were somewhere else another week and their name got on the record there. So these things have to be evaluated pretty carefully. I think another thing that I really learned from doing this is that it's really unclear how Petitot made his decisions about what it was that the particular word represented. And this is a really interesting sentence that Petitot has in the introduction to the dictionary. There's a long grammar in the introduction. So he's got this sentence, fish is not as good as meat. It actually doesn't sound to me like something somebody would say. So I think he might have made it up. So when we look at this sentence, the first word there is luga, and that means fish. And that's the word that's used in Forked Hope and Hare. And if you were to say that in Delany, in Bear Lake, it would be hlue with a voiceless L and with the G gone. Ia is also the word that's used in Forked Hope. Okay? That ina is the comparative, and it's not the one that's used in Forked Hope. And then that last word, hledi, it starts with a voiceless L. Well, that's the word that's used in Delany. And the word, if you used that word, you would say lady, but that's not actually the word you use for something being tasty in Forked Hope. So that this is probably a composed sentence. So you don't really know when he put something with a label, pot de lièvre, you don't really know what it means. I feel pretty confident when he called it bâtard loucheux that it's that, because that's his more specific form. But the general one, you really don't know what it means. Okay, so let's go back to what Sapir says. So here, it started off seeming like language change was contradictory to the overall social and cultural stability. But when we go back and really try to understand what it was that was going on at the time of Petitot in the mid-19th century, it seems like the conclusions that have been drawn are incorrect. And that in fact what we've got now is a fairly coherent view of what was going on. Little cultural change, little social change, little language change. The language looks very much today like it did at the time that Petitot was writing. And I would say that even since the 1950s, when people started going to school, that people have slowly settled into the communities, but in fact, in a lot of ways, there hasn't been very much change. On top of which, in the past 30 years or so, we find, especially in Forked Hope, a lot of language loss. And so we don't find the language being used in the same way. So the current study is really focusing on Delany. And so what happened in Delany is that that community has really become settled by people that come from various parts around Great Bear Lake. And there's a large number of people that come from a totally different group that's called Clinchon or Dog Rib that are in Delany, and there's lots of travel back and forth, lots and lots of relatives. So what we're trying with respect to the language to understand now is what's going on as this community begins to really see itself as a single community, rather than people that come from here and people that come from here and people that come from here. Is there still the degree of variation in that community? And when you look at Clinchon in particular, what you find is it's quite different than Delany in quite a few ways. Most striking is that the tones are the mirror image opposite of the tones in Delany. So where you say tsa for, it's hard with one syllable, but I think you'll hear it. When you say tsa for Delany and for beaver and Delany, you say tsa. So tsa, tsa. And you can really hear it in French words, like the word liti is the word for tea in Delany, liti is the word for tea in Clinchon. So I think you could probably hear that. There's lots of vowel differences as well. There are also differences in lexicon. morphological differences and syntactic differences. So this is what we're interested in, is how are they coming together to form something, or do we still see, with the generations, do we still see the traces of where people came from? And so this is the question that's being asked. And this is a community where there are quite a few younger speakers of the language. So it's actually possible to investigate this question in that community, unlike anywhere else in the area. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is see, and this is still not very clear in my own head, how I put the two pieces of this talk together. So I started talking off by talking about collaboration and what collaboration means. And I tried to express a concern that we not be too rigid in thinking about what collaboration means. That variation is really important here, and it's got to suit the particular circumstances, not be just some kind of model. And then the second part, I was also looking at a case where there was reported to not be much variation at a particular time, and that variation developed over time, but in fact it sort of looks like that variation has always been there. So it seems like, if this is right, that we've got a much, to me, coherent notion of what the culture, how the culture and society and the language fit together, so that we've got by recognizing the variation, we've got a more uniform explanation than we had previously. So I think what we've seen is the importance of variation. I hope this example has also shown that there's really interesting linguistic work that at this stage was really triggered for me going back to those sources, because people were really interested in this. That dictionary is hard to use, and people weren't doing it themselves, but were really interested in understanding these questions. So there's all kinds of questions that you can get to that are questions that you want to ask that you might not think to ask, but somebody else pushing you to ask them is pretty exciting. And I just started with saying something about small languages, and let me just end by saying that there's wonderful things about studying small languages as well as wonderful things about studying large languages. But we can ask very different questions often about studying, when we study large languages and study small languages. And I think for me, one of the most exciting things about this is not just learning about the language, but trying to understand a culture that at first seems very similar, and as time goes on seems very different, and that there's other value roles that I can play in that community by making use of things that I know and bringing them together with things that people know. And that's been a very satisfying experience for me, and one I think that helped me be a better linguist than I would have been otherwise. And I sometimes say to people, my mother was a social worker, and I think I need to partly be a social worker to be able to be satisfied with an intellectual life. So you've got to figure out where you stand and what it is that's satisfying to you in doing such work. Now, you can try to figure out what language this comes from. So there was a lot of French influence, and this is from French. It means thank you and then big. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that talk. I really enjoyed listening to everything you said. My question refers to the following. When I started working on Uru about 12 years ago, they were not so much interested in me. They were interested in access that I had to all the French and German sources about the language in an earlier period. So I wonder, do you have experience with kind of making older material accessible And do you have communities which are interested in this? You mentioned Petito being used by some of these people. Could you imagine a project where Petito could be turned into a useful contemporary dictionary?
Yeah, I think that Petito is really hard. Well, it takes a long time to interpret his transcription system. And there are things that he under-differentiates. So I think it would be really interesting to people to do systematic work on kind of translating Petito into modern orthography. But it would take, I couldn't do it by myself. To do this, I know a lot of the French words, but a lot of them I don't know, so I have to look up based on the slavey word. I then know what slavey word I want to find. Then I have to see if I can figure out, based on the English, what word it is in French, which isn't always easy, and then see if Petito has that word. So there's a lot of steps that are involved in doing this, but I think people would be really interested in it, because the things that are translated that people know, like the Lord's Prayer, so there are some of the hymns that are in French, and are in Slavey, and the Lord's Prayer, and I don't know, I have to admit I learned the Lord's Prayer from the Slavey because I didn't know it before that. So it's whatever else is in those books. People are really interested in knowing those. And so I think it would be a fantastic project to do. Some of Petito's other work, not the dictionary, but he was a really amazing man, and he did a huge amount of mapping, and then he wrote these books like Travels Around Great Bear Lake and things like that were written in French but translated into English, and people are really, really fascinated to read those books. So the things that are accessible. So yeah, if we had a project that really dealt with this, and we'd really need to have people that represented all these different languages, and I just gave you 2 of the languages that are included under the Podoliev column, but there are about 6 of them altogether. So yeah, I think people would be really interested.
So coming from a prosody background, I was kind of interested in the comment that you had a correspondence between a high tone in one language and a low tone in a related language.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to sort of picture the historical development there.
Yeah.
So I know for the Scandinavian languages and dialects, the historical line was actually a shifting of high tones over time, so that the high tones that are timed very early in one dialect are timed so late in a related language that they're even on the next syllable. Would that be a plausible line of development here? Or did you actually get a kind of a split where something rose in one dialect and fell in another, or got flipped around?
There's a lot of debate about this, and it's actually interesting how within, so this Clinchon and Slavey, that's one of the major differences between them, and there's other really closely related languages where that's the major difference. So the hypothesis about the development of tone is that it developed out of what's sometimes called vowel constriction, but basically out of following glottal stops, and it developed into tone. And that's one possibility. There hasn't been enough phonetic work done on the tones, but that's definitely one possibility, that it could have to do with timing on the vowel. And this doesn't really answer your question, but I'll just tell you something else about how prosody and tone interact in For Good Hope. So the historical scenario is pretty unclear, and it's not marked at all in the Petito document, so we can't figure out anything from it. But in For Good Hope, what's happened is that the language is verb final, and high tones on verb stems, I'm going to simplify it, but they've pretty much moved onto the syllable before the verb stem in that dialect. My own guess is that that has to do with intonational lows, and that there's final intonational lows, and if you want to preserve the high, then it's moving further to the left in order to preserve that high. Whereas the other dialects, it's a little bit difficult to hear the difference when it's absolute final between high tone, low tone stems and high tone stems when they're absolute final. So, but I think that's a different process than the flip-flopping of the tones. So I think we'd really have to do much more careful phonetic work than has been done. And that would tell us where the tones currently are on the vowels rather than, so where they're currently aligned on the vowels rather than about historical alignment. One other thing I can say is that, and I don't know if this is any kind of evidence at all, but in writing, people know that there's a difference between two syllables in terms of the tone, but they don't know where to write it. We just write the high tone, as you saw here, but they don't know where to write it. So I don't know how much that's just not being really writing very much, and how much it might have to do with knowing that there's a difference between them, but perceiving it in a, being able to perceive it either way. I don't know, but I think that's a possibility.
Yeah, I wasn't, hi. I wasn't totally sure what your position was on the question of whether you think, even though obviously there's a huge amount of speculation in this, that the same families that now speak in one language, then those families or locales or whatever had that language at that time, so that the patterns are kind of stable, and we're just kind of duped by the patterns of documentation, or if you think there's been transition, and I'll say why I am wondering. The colonial interaction patterns obviously are not as severe as what happened in Pacific Coast Athabascan, where lots of people were put on reservations and so on, and so there were really drastically different social interactions that were forced. But still, I would think that in the context of the forts getting set up and people having to now have a social focus around trading with the forts and so on, I could imagine that would produce not only different interactional patterns, but also different ideological orientations. And if there was an ambient bilingualism / dialectalism, and also people kind of could vary back and forth, I could imagine that it would be pretty easy to switch the valuation of these speech varieties, and so for large areas to actually switch over pretty fast. So I guess I wonder what you think about that.
The impression that I have is that, so that term batarlushe, so what the ethnographic literature says is, oh well, those people had completely disappeared. And I don't think that's true. I think that's basically what Fort Good Hope is those people that they say had disappeared. That group of people hunted way more kind of north and west, and the ones that are called Bear Lake were more around Great Bear Lake. They definitely would have intersected with each other, and there's intermarriage across. The sense I also have, but I'm not positive about this, but the sense I have is that when people moved from one community to another, they took on the major dialect markers of the community that they moved to. And I've seen that with people in Delaney from Fort Good Hope, and then people in Delaney from some of the other Slavey communities, where the sounds that I wrote on here are totally different yet again. So I think the situation probably overall stabilized fairly quickly, because my impression is that people didn't really spend lots of time in the forts, and that they kind of became associated with the forts because their names got written in ledgers there for, well, the treaties weren't signed until the 1920s, So it might be that they came to the fort to trade and then got their name written down there. So that's my impression, is that they really, like, these weren't sort of settlements where people hung around. They were more places where people went for a specific purpose for a short amount of time. And almost all of the time was still the bush life that had been for a really long time. And it was the trading and maybe the missions that, again, brought them in for short amounts of time. So I think it's different than the Pacific Coast situation. I think it really didn't change. That's the impression I have from talking to people and from the literature, that it didn't change very much. And they'd intersect with different people, but it was largely the same group that stayed together. Does that?
So this is just kind of an informational question. You say that one of the questions you're looking at now is whether this community is currently developing a new community standard. Is that happening? I mean, in what you've seen, or does it, or do they keep these languages still separate?
I think that on the particular things that I talked about here, especially the ends, I think that people coming to that community use ends, whatever they used elsewhere. And there's a variety of variations, N's and D's. I show N's and R's I showed you, but there's also prenasalized stops, and I haven't heard those. I wasn't really listening for those when I listened to the tapes, but I made a point of listening to some that I know are Fort Good Hope background and I know are other Slavey dialect backgrounds. The thing I wasn't listening for at all was vowels. And there's really big vowel differences between the Clinchon and what's called Slavey. There's large vowel differences, so I wasn't listening for those. And I think it would be hard to hear the tones. I'd have to figure out what I was listening for to hear the word tones in the context, but those are the things that I would pay attention to. There are things that when I first went there about 30 years ago, like the vowels, there was definitely variation in vowels. So some people would say the word mountain is she, and some would say shu. So have they converged on something like that? Some would say water is tu, and some would say ti. Some would say hat-on for fall, and some would say hat-on. So I don't know whether people have converged on there. So I kind of know the things to look for, and also the lexical items. And are they developing these community lexical items? There's also, so would Fort Good Hope people stop using do as a negative? I don't know. So there's other kind of, I just did the phonological and lexical ones because they're easy to show, but there's also some morphological differences and some syntactic differences, different particles, different question words. So those are the things to look for first, are the things where we know that, at least in the older generation, there's differences between Delany and the other communities. And that's what we're doing now.
I gather you have some sympathy for a relatively flexible, collaborative approach. Can you give us examples from your own 30 years experience with the community of how questions you came in with have been reshaped and how your work has changed?
Well, I don't think I ever would have done this kind of work 30 years ago. So I think this. I think that when I first began doing field work, it was much more that I was working on writing a grammar and a dictionary. So doing that kind of work, I think that this is an interesting question to think about. With the dictionary, I think that we became a much more community project to do the dictionary. The idea we have now, it probably will never happen, but it's a real kind of electronic dictionary where people sort of like Wikipedia, but we thought of it before Wikipedia started, but we didn't have the software when we thought of it. But we would really like it to be in Slavey and not be bilingual, if that's what people want, and this particular community has an interest in that. I've done a huge amount of work on mapping with people and place names because that's a really strong interest that people have, and what they wanted was them to be written down and the stories about them written, and so I did a lot of that, especially at a time when there were land claims that overlapped, and so people were really interested in what their hunting areas were to show that they had names and had been there for a long time. And actually, the current names are the names that you find in Petitot's work. So these names are at least 150 years old, the names that are still used now. So that's a kind of work that I don't think that I would have gotten involved with. There's a lot of issues around space and how space is conceptualized that I think there are common questions in linguistics today, but there are also common questions that people have because of relationships with the land. And so you kind of start asking questions about those things. I've learned a lot of vocabulary, like about moose parts that I would never know, because people are interested in really detailed analyses of those. And this is another one that we haven't acted on, but is just sort of an interesting one. When this writing system was developed, there were a lot more, the people that wanted to become, the value of literacy at that time was perceived of as the value for people who were speakers of the language. But that's a really different situation today because it depends on the community, but overall in this area, there aren't that many speakers. And so we used kind of basic IPA for developing these orthographies together with, for the vowels, together with English-based consonants. If I was starting again today, I would use English-based. I know that's an anathema to many linguists, but so many people want you to translate these things into English-based things because they don't know how to read the vowel symbols, and they'd rather have them be like English. So I think if we had listened better at the time that we were really doing the orthography standardization, we would have made different choices than the choices that we made. That's probably not very likely to change now because there's enough in writing that people don't want to change it. So I think it's just, for me, it's made me go back and think about things. It's made me think about the value of language use as opposed to the value of language structure. I'm really interested in language structure, but what you need in these communities is way more about language use than it is about language structure. We've done a lot of surveys of language use and play. I mean, we haven't done it, but people have done them, focused on developing programs for like mothers and babies to use the language. So sort of thinking about educational uses. So those are just some of the things. They're not so much the linguistic structural aspects, but all sort of the broadening of the sense of what it is that you can do as a linguist that actually people are going to get really excited about. And in the end, the structural stuff, the more people start working, say, on curriculum material, the more they realize you have to know some of this stuff in order to develop those curriculum materials. So finding the ways of communicating the things and helping people kind of gain their own sense of it. And I guess I could give one example from the work that the Ojibwe students were doing in Toronto of reconceptualizing things in terms of 4 directions, which is a very core Aboriginal notion, at least amongst the Ojibwe. And so these 4 directions made them rethink how they presented the very complex Algonquian verb morphology in a way that's just led to such a difference with the students in terms of their being able to engage. So these are new learners, and they've engaged with the material in a way they never did before. So I think that you can see those kinds of things happening when you do this kind of work.
you mentioned that the focus should be more from from an outsider perspective, should shift more towards an insider perspective, and that people within the community should try to collaborate in the stuff you're producing. So I'm wondering what sort of collaborators or what sort of insiders you're talking about when you mention those. I mean, obviously, it's probably going to be the consultants that you worked with before. It's probably going to be the tribal council members or something who are in charge of, writing curricula and stuff. But also, I'm wondering if you involve the youth in such projects, and what specific roles you give them.
Okay, in this particular community, there's been huge involvement of the youth. So there's got to be permission. So let me first say, I was saying that that's what's going on in this community, and that's what is being called for in Aboriginal research methodology. But you want to be careful to say that's not what should happen all over. But in this particular community, there's huge involvement of the youth. And so they're involved in doing interviews with the elders. They're involved in, some of them are doing transcription, some of them are doing Elon. So it sort of depends on the person and what their interests are. Some of them are doing translation. Some people love doing the translation. Some people really like doing the transcription. So facilitating workshops, because in that community there's a lot of language, but as soon as the English speakers are there, you don't get as much of the language. There's a lot more English. So if it's facilitated by people that are speakers, then there's going to be a lot more native language. So then you're going to see how people talk to each other without the interference of the outsider. There can still be a lot of English, but so the youth are just sort of involved in the widest range of roles, as are the elders. So that it's really, I think that this particular project is seen as ways of getting at questions that are of interest to a lot of people in the community and involving as many people in the community. But I'd have to say, I think that all the projects I've been involved with, youth have been a critical part of it in one way or another. Because youth are really seen as the future, and if the youth aren't kind of understanding that question of what it means to be a Dene person or whatever, then they're not going to be the future that brings with them the past in the way the elders would like it to be there. There's going to be a future, but they want them to have the past as a piece of them. Does that make sense?
Hi. So it's related. I definitely agree with your view that there can't be just one rigid model of the collaborative, way of doing research. But at the same time, I guess my question is, the non-collaborative way you said is, it's not negative, and I agree that it's not negative when the researcher's interest aligns with the community's interests and they have the same goal, but in many cases, it might be the case that, researchers, interests or goal might not align with, what communities' needs are. And I guess this question arose because, for example, before I wrote my thesis, I had to, get IRB approval because I was working with human subjects, and they had to make sure that I wasn't going to do any harm. And say, in documenting indigenous languages, there is, it's impossible to have sort of like a regulating system that makes sure that linguists are doing work that is going to benefit, the community's needs. I guess, so my question would be how do you keep the linguists, how do you keep us accountable? Or can there be a system that keeps linguists accountable?
I think it's interesting to read the work that, so Lise Dobrin's article in Language about working in Papua New Guinea, or the article in Language Documentation and Conservation that Gary Holton wrote, which is a comparison of the work that he did in Alaska, which is very much, the person, April Counselor, who I quoted, is from Alaska. And Papua New Guinea, the work that he's been doing there, where I think that in those places, it's not that they're unaccountable, but that the intellectual knowledge is highly valued there for itself. And so it's understanding those kinds of things. And I don't now, I'm not that familiar with the IRB system in the United States. We have in Canada the same thing, it's just called something different. But the regulations around it have really changed to try to broaden perspectives. And now we actually have to write about community-based research and what it means and what the values are. So we're really accountable for thinking of things and how things work in a particular community from our perspective anyway. And it's hard to step outside your own perspective in a lot of ways. But we're accountable to thinking about that at the beginning when we put in those protocols. And so I don't know the exact answer to that. You've got to kind of hope that the most of the people that do field work are going to be sensitive to the situations and listen and try to understand what it is that's considered of value here. But you see a lot of cases where people just write, oh, well, I'll give them a copy of the thesis I write, or I'll make a dictionary for them. Well, maybe they want to do it themselves. Maybe they don't. So how do you work those things out? And it's only by the communication that you can begin to figure out what the roles are. So the IRB stuff is hard because it's got to be done all in advance and in a very changing field. And I think what I like about the Canadian one now is that it recognizes that any kind of research that involves people working with each other is not static, it's dynamic, and it's going to be in different places at different times. I don't have a good answer for it because I don't think there's a good answer to what relationships are all about because there are many different things.